Why do any lives matter? You know, we live in a fascinating cultural moment right now where issues of racism and equality and injustice are daily on our television screens, particularly the issue of racism. And you know, that's one I feel quite dearly, really. I grew up in a part of South London that was very multicultural, and I can remember in the 1970s and 1980s being at school with friends who were from countries like Pakistan or the continent of Africa and so forth, and just seeing the racism there and the language that was used against some of my school friends, and even back there in the 70s and 80s being deeply angered by that. Well, thankfully, here we are in the 21st century, and in many ways, things have improved tremendously, but in other ways, they haven't. And I know many of my friends from different ethnic backgrounds still find life tough, and what do we do about this? But, you know, lying behind all of these issues of racism and injustice and inequality that we see discussed in the media, you know, lies for me a question that often lies unaddressed. And it's simply this question: why do any lives matter? You know, if we live in a universe in which there is no God, if atheistic naturalism holds true, then all of us, no matter what our racial background, are just, to quote Bertrand Russell, the famous atheist, just random conglomerations of atoms. More than that, we are just the result of time plus chance plus natural selection. And why is it that simply bearing the title human brings any particular rights? And you know, the person who brings this question out for me incredibly powerfully is the father of evolutionary theory himself, Charles Darwin. You know, it's interesting that in all this talk of cancel culture and people from the past being removed from the historical record because of their views on race, it's interesting that as yet Charles Darwin has not had his record questioned. But his famous book, The Origin of the Species, which founded evolutionary theory, bears a subtitle. It bears the subtitle, The Preservation of Favoured Races in the Struggle for Life. It's a pretty controversial subtitle. If you read one of Darwin's other famous books, The Descent of Man, in that book, Darwin comes across as pretty racist in some of his attitudes. He describes many non-white races as savages. Listen to these words from Darwin. He writes, how little can the hard-worked wife of a degraded Australian savage, who uses hardly any abstract words and cannot count above 4, how can she exert her self-consciousness or reflect on the nature of her own existence? During his famous voyage on his ship, the Beagle, he describes encountering a particular race of natives on one island. And again, he wrote in his journal and in Descent of Man, he said, I could hardly bring myself to realise that these savages were of the same race as me. And he goes on to attack their intelligence and other things and so forth. Now, Darwin, maybe you could say we give him a free pass because of the views of his day, but we haven't done that to others. But that racism that he showed arguably found its way into his theory of natural selection, which, if you're not careful, leads you to all too easily start looking down on others who you don't believe to be as superior as you are. That's no basis at all for racial equality. There is actually only one basis for equality I know of anywhere, and it's not in our genetic makeup, it's not in our evolutionary heritage, it's certainly not in the atoms that make us up, but it's the Bible's teaching that everybody, male or female, black or white, no matter what our race or our colour or our creed, bear the image of God and have value because of who made us and whose image he made us in. And getting that into your DNA, to pardon the pun, can change you profoundly. Because one of the other questions lying behind the racial issues tearing our culture apart is not merely how we find justice, but how we change people. How do you change hearts? How do you change the heart of somebody who maybe is racist into, how do you change their heart into being somebody who can look on others who are different with compassion and generosity? You know, one of my friends is a gentleman called Thomas Tarrants. And Tom recently last year or so, published his autobiography. It's an amazing book called Consumed by Hate, Redeemed by Love. Tom, back in the 1960s, was a vicious, racist thug. He lived in the USA, he was a member of the Ku Klux Klan, he was quite literally on the FBI's most wanted list. He hated African Americans, he hated Jewish people, and he was involved in a vicious campaign of violence. And in fact, the book opens with a story of him going to blow up the house of a leading Jewish member of the city where he lived. Well, he was caught by the FBI, flung into one of America's toughest prisons, facing a 30-year prison sentence and a heart full of hatred. But in that book, Tom describes how in that prison cell, after he'd been there in prison for some years, finally he was introduced to the Bible, and finally he was introduced to Jesus Christ. He gave his life to Christ. He came to understand what it means that Christ had died not just for him, but for all human beings. And he came to realize what it meant for human beings to be made in God's image. And when he was released eventually from prison, he went on to not just turn his life around, but to get involved in racial reconciliation work, not just in his community, but even to reach out to those that he'd wronged and hated before. It's a powerful story of how the gospel of Jesus can turn a life around. Why do any lives matter? Because we're made in God's image and because Christ died for us. How do you change a heart full of hatred into one full of love? I know of only one force in the world powerful enough to do that, and that is the transforming power of Jesus Christ.